problem is that his feed rate exceeded the state of the art that we have today in drag saws that use diamond. And so the article was based on flawed logic. Now, it almost looks like the blade had a curvature to it. So, there's one way to find out if it was a curvature, and that is to put a straight edge on it.
There you go. That's a pretty big blade to do that. That's probably what that hole is over there where the blade was in.
Yeah.
So this is Chris testing for flatness of a possible ancient cut surface.
But it's actually quite flat. Well, no, it's got a bit of a... The surface comes out here and then it kicks in.
You've got two
right
cuts,
in there.
two different cuts there.
Yeah, you've got two different cuts, yeah. It comes down to here. Actually, there's three. It ends there, then it steps out. There's one there, and then it slips out. It appears that when they were actually placing these basalt blocks into the table, they were just kind of slicing off just to make them fit, just to, you know, have the top surfaces come together, and just knocking off little pieces here and there.
That's an ancient saw cut, you can tell. Because here, you look at that, you can see how the surface could have been pounded by stone to get the surface. But here, that's clearly evidence of some kind of tool like a saw cutting through the material for the top half. This is at the Great Pyramid. And similar to Peru, what we see is different materials, different forms of workmanship from crude to incredibly refined. Here again, we're going to look at another saw cut example. But this is, I'm just blown away. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza. But here, have a look at this. This is an obvious saw cut. See, this is the rough layer, and then this is not only flat-ish, but you can see where the cutter, like the saw or whatever, stopped, because here is where it's broken away. And on this side too. But what blows me away is just the number, the amount of evidence here is nuts.
Oh, I know.
So this is the Great Pyramid at Giza. And there, the original, what's left of the original casing stone, you can see right there. And this is just our first half an hour here, and this blows me, it completely blows me away, because we've seen obvious evidence of machine cutting technology in basalt, which would require, as far as I'm concerned, tungsten carbide or diamond tools. And that's obviously why we're here with Christopher Dunn and Stephen Mailer, because Chris is the expert on technology. He works in a very modern establishment and has done for 50 years in terms of working with the most modern high-tech equipment for cutting materials and shaping materials. Here in the British Museum, there's one object which has attracted my curiosity, and that's this thing. It looks like it's a segment of a larger structure, but what's intriguing are the holes that are in it, because these definitely look machined. And see how even that is, perfectly round. And this might be the mark here of where the machine bit, core drill possibly slipped. Now this one is a different diameter than this one. And the surface, this front surface, I put a card next to it, and as in a business card. It'd be nice to bring a ruler, but it's amazingly flat. And this groove that's cut into it here, you see the continuity? Maybe like a router shaped it, as well as this one up here. If you look at that, look at the profile of it as I go back and forth. Very consistent. That's more like it. And these on-fluted, oh, okay, these are feet. Maybe. But very consistent. Now the stone itself is very hard. And on the back, you see this, which is kind of odd. And again, you see where the hole is. Some people would suggest that these holes were done when the British decided to remove these objects and bring them to the British Museum in order to make them easier to lift, but this isn't really that big in size. Here's my hand, so you can see a sense of scale. And also the markings, or this damage around the outside where the tool may have exited, that's incredibly heavily worn. It's not like 100 years of wear, it's like God knows how long. So my suspicion, and the hieroglyphics are not, you know, that exacting. My suspicion is that this object is of incredible antiquity and was later recycled, holes already in it, and made into an art object. But it'd be interesting to see what people like Christopher Dunn have to say about it. Here we have limestone, probably Greco-Roman, and then behind and around mud brick wall later, and before that is this. Look at the sheer scale of this limestone building. And the best way to look, of course, is to compare with living human figures walking around. The angle of the wall is really curious as well. And once again at Edfu, and it's always the sense of scale which grabs your attention first. But not only that, it's the volume of carvings, the amount of sculpted surfaces, and the different ages of them too. All the hieroglyphics are not from the same time period. The ones which are recessed like this are more recent in general than the ones here, which are exposed, or which are come out from the surface. At one time, this building, even though it's so monstrous and monumental in scale, was completely filled in by centuries and centuries of garbage. And it was only about 100 years ago that it was excavated. And that, well, the garbage aspect isn't good. The good aspect is that all of that refuse, which was mainly bricks and broken pottery and sand, helped to preserve much of the carving of the surfaces.
So we have been here before with Dr. Robert Chuck. He's the most famous geologist, everyone know him. And he explained for us how he sees this through geology. And we have also Susan with us, who is going to be our techno-spiritual geologist from this day further. And what we want to say basically that the horizontal erosion that we see here is not the water erosion, because it descends, as you can see. It goes lower with the level, and this cannot be water, basically because water levels itself. And that the vertical erosion we see here in all this area and here in the back down here, this is the real water erosion from rainwater. That never been the climate of the Sahara here, of the desert here. As he said, 9,700 BC.
Is the conservative estimate for when the water erosion occurred?
This is when that weather was not here,
right.
9,700.
In other words, it's been desert conditions since then.
Exactly.
And also the rounded nature is... When he first came here with John Anthony West in 1992 and looked up here, he said, this is clear textbook evidence of water erosion, rounded layer. And now we know further from the tour he just did with the KEMET tour, he explained on video that he has mapped every stratigraphic layer of here, every different layer, because limestone, as Susan will attest to, forms heterogeneous, not homogeneous. You have hard layer, softer layer, harder layer, softer layer, harder layer, and he mapped the erosion for every layer, and he can date what time it was eroded on. And so we have come up with an estimate that there was an event here 30,000 years ago known as the Mousterian subpluvial, only time it rained that much in Africa, to cause this type of erosion. And I discussed that with Susan last year, that we should have a benchmark here at least 30,000 years. And off record, Dr. Schock said to Yusuf it could be 80,000 years ago.
But that would mean that it was sculpted at least 5,000 years prior to the dynastic Egyptians being in existence in this area.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay. And Susan?
These are all limestones. You can see the difference in here. This one up here, you can see corals, shells, various things. It was almost a reefal material, whereas this would be a muddy limestone. This back into a more competent limestone, and that is the natural way that the rock will erode. Those vertical ones are not the natural way the rock will erode. That is from water erosion, whereas this is the normal way it will erode.
So what we can see is the fact that this massive sculpture has been repaired over and over and over, probably through the dynastic times and all the way through to the 20th century, which makes it a complete mess if you want to figure out the original design. But what is clearly obvious is as we go up, you see the erosion layers. You see how heavy the erosion is. There's another repair. But when you get to the head, you can see that the head is barely eroded. And that clearly indicates that the head was recarved long after this erosion took place. As well, there are many accounts through history, including, I believe, during the dynastic times, where this, which is called the Sphinx enclosure, was filled with sand. And so, over the hundreds of years, the Sphinx was dug out, the sand was taken away, but then the wind would blow the sand back in. So that means that for a high percentage of the time, the Sphinx's body was covered in sand, and the sand would protect it from wind erosion, and yet the head would have been exposed above that surface. So the fact that the face and the head are not highly eroded clearly indicates that the Sphinx's head was recarved at least once afterwards, after all the erosion, possibly many times. So you can't identify the age of the Sphinx itself with the face that is being portrayed, because the face was supposedly the representation of one of the so-called pharaoh's mothers. He had the face recarved. Another curious thing is that people are looking for what are called the halls of records, or the hall of records underneath the Sphinx. And it's no coincidence that this boardwalk here has been put in place. It's not simply there in order for people to walk on it so they don't get their shoes dirty, but we've been told by an inside source that the opening or entrance to the tunnel system under the Sphinx is under this boardwalk. So the reason why this is called the Sphinx enclosure is because the bedrock was cut out in order to reveal the shape of the body, as you can tell. Also, we've heard that the erosion, at least the water-based erosion, is at least 10,000 years old, making the body of the Sphinx at least 5,000 years older than the dynastic Egyptian. And people talk about the idea again that there are tunnels and or chambers under the Sphinx. And here we see clearly that this could be an entrance. It's hard to tell how far down it goes. There is a ladder going down, but whether it has been refilled or whether it's solely this deep is hard to tell because of the darkness. Now the question of how the material was removed in order to create the body of the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure is very fascinating, because rather than the idea of a bunch of people with adzes or bronze axes or bronze shovels or chisels or whatever, in fact, the material was removed in the form of massive blocks. And so that's what you're looking at. We have Jeffrey here, and the ancient builders, pre-dynastic, removed these massive blocks of limestone from the Sphinx enclosure and created what we now call the Sphinx temple out of it. And it is not simply this wall we're looking at. So it wasn't that a few blocks were removed, because you can see the amount of volume involved. And this is where we find all of those blocks, here in the remains of the Sphinx temple. And the even more amazing aspect about this is, as you can see here, it looks as if they cut a block out, put it into place, cut the next block from the enclosure, put it into place, because look at the horizontal lines of different layers of hardness. Another block was removed from the enclosure and put into place there. And we see that in many cases, like over again at the wall you're looking at. Now, something that reinforces the idea that there are levels of chambers or tunnels under the Sphinx is that, as you can see, it was constructed on bedrock. That's the bedrock, and this is also the bedrock. But as we approach the front paws, there's a transition between the bedrock and these, which are clearly inserted and could be the roof of a chamber, the chamber lying underneath the paws. Also, what we can see up here is evidence that the officials were drilling into the bedrock in order to see if there was an underground chamber. But have a look at the locations of where the actual drill holes are. So this is about halfway down the body of the Sphinx. And you can see these caps are on top of angle drilling, core drilling, I believe in the 90s or perhaps after that, in order to see if there are holes or chambers or tunnels under the Sphinx. As we round basically the elbow, and here we have another one. And here we have another one. But again, what's curious is the transition between the bedrock here and these obvious blocks which were set into place. They're basically at ground level. So do they represent a cover over top of the chamber? And is the front access to the Sphinx, in fact, right in this area here, covered by the boardwalk? Because again, when we go to this side, the bedrock is there, the slabs are here, continuing all the way to the end of the other paw, where again we have the bedrock.